This is Myers Chapter 3C, which focuses on genetics and the evolutionary psychology and behavior. Behavior genetics. Behavior geneticists study our differences and weigh the effects and interplay of heredity versus the environment. So, in other words, they are looking at the whole nature versus nurture argument again. How does nature, what we're born with, and the environment that we live in and that we function in, how those things affect behavior? Now, when we look at genes, we have to break them apart. We have 46 chromosomes, each human being. 23 come from mom and 23 come from dad. And the chromosomes are composed of a coiled molecule known as DNA. Genes are the small segments of the giant DNA molecules, and they form the words of those chromosomes. Environmental events turn on those genes. When they are turned on, genes provide the building blocks of our physical development. A genome is the complete instructions for making an organism. So in other words, it's all the genetic material in the chromosomes. And what's really interesting is that chimpanzees actually have 96% of our DNA sequence. So there's only a 4% difference between humans and the human's gene sequence, genome, or DNA sequence, and that of a chimpanzee, which is really fascinating. When we look at twins, we can learn a lot about how genes work. Identical twins come from a single fertilized egg that splits into two. This is also called nature's clones. Now, these twins have the same genes, but they don't always have the same number of copies of those genes, which helps explain why one twin may be more at risk for certain illnesses than the other. They may have the same genes, but different numbers of copies of those genes. Also, most identical twins share one placenta in the womb, but 1 in 3 have separate placentas. So in that case, one twin's placenta might provide slightly better nourishment than the other twin's placenta. So there is your first example of environment playing a role on development. As you can see from this diagram, fraternal twins develop from separate fertilized eggs. And so they're very, very different. Studies, however, of identical twins show that on both scales of extroversion and neuroticism, how neurotic they are, identical twins are much more similar than fraternal twins. Now, there have been several studies to look at the strengths of our genes, and twins are often used for these purposes. The most famous is the University of Minnesota studies on identical twins that were separated at birth. This is the famous Jim twins that were in your textbook. These were two males that were adopted out at birth to two blue-collar families. And after 38 years of separation, they were tested, and they had tests measuring their personality, their intelligence, their heart rate, and brain waves. And what the researchers found is that they were virtually alike, as if tested the same person twice, as if they tested the same person twice. So it was really fascinating. And this study was by Thomas Bouchard. And so, however, a lot of critics of Bouchard said, well, you can't really compare this one study of these twins and generalize it to overall population. But People who have looked at virtual twins, which are unrelated siblings who are the same age biologically, found that they also were much more dissimilar than identical twins. So, in fact, they say, you can learn a lot from identical twin studies about the strength of our genes or the strength of nature over nurture. We can also look at the difference between genetic and environmental relatives. So, with genetic relatives, you have a biological connection. The parents and the siblings are all related biologically. With environmental relatives, you're talking about adoptive parents and siblings. And what they have found in some of these studies is that traits such as extroversion and agreeableness with adopted children, they are more like their biological parents than their adoptive parents. So these traits, extroversion, agreeableness, personality traits, tend to be more closely tied to their biological parents than the adoptive parents. And so findings are that people who grow up together, whether they're biologically related or not, often do not resemble each other much in personality. So heredity does shape our personality. Parenting, on the other hand, shapes our attitudes, values, manners, faith, politics, things like that. Adopted children also scored higher on IQ tests and were more happier and more stable adults than their biological parents, which demonstrates the importance of the environment that you were raised in, even if your personality traits might resemble your biological parents more than your adoptive parents. Another important term is heritability, and this refers to the differences among people that are attributed to our genes. Or if we talk about the heritability of a trait, this is the extent to which variation among individuals can be attributed to their differing genes. So, differences among people, an example of this might be height, the heritability of height. Now, it's important to note when we talk about heritability, you cannot generalize heritable traits between individuals to heritable group differences. In other words, you can't say aggression in a person can be generalized to an aggressive group of people. So there is a difference in heritability, the differences of traits between individuals rather than heritable group differences. Another important thing to look at is the fact that genes not only code for particular proteins or building blocks, but they also respond to environments. For example, people with identical genes but differing experiences have similar but not identical minds. So genes are regulating, and nature and nurture work together to shape who we are. Another way of looking at this is that environments trigger gene activity. Sometimes we say traits evoke significant responses in other people. Someone might look at birth order theory and place it here. Is the fact that you have an older brother or sister, does that evoke significant responses in you? Does that trigger gene activity? It's just a different way of looking at the gene environment interaction. A new area is the area of molecular genetics. Molecular genetics seek to identify specific genes influencing behavior. The goal is to find some of the many genes that influence normal human traits, such as body weight, sexual orientation, and extroversion, and also to explore the mechanisms that control expression. Genetic tests scan now reveal at risk populations for many diseases. An example of this would be new genetic tests for breast cancer, like Angelina Jolie came up positive for breast cancer, and so she had a double mastectomy to prevent that gene being turned on and causing breast cancer. These can also present some ethical dilemmas because you could have people doing selective abortion for sex selection, which has become an issue in China. An important area of evolutionary psychology is the area of natural selection. And evolutionary psychologists focus on what makes us so much alike as humans. And they look at this through the idea of natural selection, which has three parts. First, an organism's varied offspring compete for survival. Second, certain biological and behavior variations increase organisms' reproductive and survival chances in their particular environment. 3. Offspring that survive are more likely to pass their genes to ensuing generations. Thus, over time, population characteristics may change. When certain traits are selected by conferring a reproductive advantage to an individual or a species, those traits over time will prevail. Example would be dog breeders. Our adaptive flexibility in responding to different environments contributes to our fitness, our ability to survive and reproduce. Thus, the idea of survival of the fittest. Also, our behavioral and biological similarities arise from our shared human genome. No more than 5% of the genetic differences among humans arise from population group differences. Also, we are genetically predisposed to behave in ways that promoted our ancestors surviving and reproducing. For example, we crave sweets and fat for fat storage during times of famine. However, today, this would bring about obesity and diabetes. You also talk about the second Darwinian revolution, so the application of evolutionary psychology today. And an example of this would be a study of why infants start to fear strangers about the time they become mobile. So you have evolutionary psychologists looking for these things today. Another area they've studied is human sexuality. And they've done some interesting studies that show that men have a much lower threshold of interpreting a woman's warm responses towards them as a sexual come-on, because men have a stronger tendency towards sex. Some interesting studies have been done looking at the evolutionary explanation of our selection of mating partners. So in terms of approaches to sex, females are relational and males are recreational, so to speak. In terms of our ancestral history, females pair wisely by men pairing widely. So males prefer healthy, fertile-appearing women because they stood a better chance of sending their genes into the future. So men were most attracted to women at ages of peak fertility. So you'd have younger boys attracted to older women in their 20s and 30s, and older men being attracted to younger women who were also in their 20s and 30s because they're attracted to women at peak fertility age. Women, on the other hand, are attracted to mature, dominant, bold, and affluent men because they are long-term mating partners and they have an investment in their joint offspring and the potential to support and protect that offspring. Evolutionary psychologists would also say that nature selects behaviors that increase the likelihood of sending one's genes into the future. Now, they also do some backward theorizing. So they start with an effect and work backward to find an explanation. Sometimes they also looked at the impact of social influences and the idea that social expectations also shape gender differences in our mating preferences. Some final reflections. Differences initiated by our nature might be amplified by our nurture. Gender roles shape us. Genes are all pervasive but not all powerful. People may defy their genetic pull to reproduce, for example. Culture also affects us. We may defy or do the opposite of what is expected. There is a lot of controversy between science and religion over evolution, so this is an always evolving topic. You also have Roger Sperry's view that the mind and brain act together as a holistic system. The brain creates and controls the emergent mind, which in turn influences the brain. So if we think about pizza, we salivate. So it's kind of an interesting idea. I hope you've enjoyed this short look at evolutionary psychology.